You're listening to Puma Podcast.
I wonder if they know that their comments have a tangible effect on people's lives and preventing people from being who they truly want to be. But it's still very much scary to be a trans person right now in the Philippines, to be LGBTQ in the Philippines.
Hi, I'm Franco Luna, Puma Podcast. You're listening to Teka Teka News. In this episode, let's look at Filipinos' expressed support and embrace for LGBTQ people, but then also dive into the actual online chatter about the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans communities. A new study discussed in a recent webinar shows Filipinos aren't consistent between what they say they think and what they actually say or do. In a recent study, Syn Strat, a social media intelligence and strategy firm, combed through hundreds of media articles related to LGBTQ issues, events, and personalities. These articles were from June 2022 to May 2023, and Syn Strat in particular looked at social media engagement, that's comments, likes, reactions, and such, with what the articles had to say. The social conversations they found are first and above all driven by personalities.
Most of the highly engaging stories are about LGBTQ plus celebrities. In fact, several of them throughout the year are about Vice Ganda in particular. This already quickly tells us that LGBTQ plus public figures or celebrities are online Filipinos' main entry point or exposure to LGBTQ plus discourse. Vice Ganda in particular may be, for many Filipinos, even their primary exposure to LGBTQ plus issues and experiences.
This is Mint Marquez. She's the CEO of Syn Strat.
Compared to policy concerns or other topics falling under any other dimension that I explained earlier, the identity and experiences of LGBTQ plus celebrities have assimilated into the mainstream.
Mint says they were looking into media stories that could give insight on LGBTQ inclusion or inclusivity in the Philippines. In particular, 5 dimensions or lenses through which they might measure people's sentiments or at least appreciation for the forces that impact LGBTQ lives: health, economic well-being, education, political and civic participation, personal security and violence, and visibility.
We put all of those 2,300 plus headlines in a word pair map to visualize the relationships between various keywords. And in doing this, these were the 5 topical clusters that we found: LGBTQ plus rights, drag pageantry, soji equality, trans empowerment, and Vice Ganda and Iron Perez. These signal the topics that have been influential in the narrative landscape of LGBTQ plus issues from the past year.
Most angles that had anything to do with the LGBT community were often about pageants and then about celebrities coming out.
Comments were mostly inclusive, mostly supportive of Vice Ganda and their desire to explore surrogacy to have a child. And the discussions here were really leveraging that traditional and cultural belief that we also have, that I'm sure maybe other people in this call have heard in their own personal experiences, that it's important to have these blood relations, or it's important to have a child because, for example, who will take care of you when you're older?
But outside celebrities, there was also positive sentiment for stories whose themes intersected with other highly held Filipino values, like family.
Another story that fell under the visibility dimension was this story about this father who let his child dress up as a mermaid. So this story went viral. It came out in April, got about 55,000 engagements. That's really the story, is that this child dressed up as a mermaid and the father was rather supportive of it.
In case you missed it, John Alexis Avestruz shared a photo of him carrying his son Santino, who was dressed in a rainbow-colored mermaid costume. In front of them were mermaid-themed cakes and cupcakes. On a Facebook post, he also wrote this message for his child: "Hindi ako magician para gawin kang iha, pero mahal kita, kaya suporta ako sa kung anuman ang gusto mo. Ayan na ang wish mo, isa ka ng sirena. Huwag mo hayaang ibaba nila ang bandera mo."
The father basically recognized that identity in his child and supported that expression. When we look at the word pair map of this, what we see is that 48.6% of the discourse was inclusive and supportive of the father, actually. And in articulating that support for the father, a term that we saw frequently was mabuting ama, for being supportive of his child's desires.
Beyond these feel-good stories of celebrities, individuals, and specific families, however, Syn Strat says Filipino sentiments towards larger LGBT issues are far less clear-cut, and certainly far less embracing or supportive. Most online Filipinos, for example, still treat violence against LGBTQ plus individuals as just another instance of violence. They dismiss or reject, while some even justify, the gender dimension to the attacks. Remember that viral story of a transgender woman who wasn't allowed to use the woman's dressing room at the BGC? People were quick to jump on her then. And Mint says it goes to a common thinking among Filipinos rooted in deep-seated practices and cultural instincts.
Another theme in the discussion was gender essentialism, people insisting that gender should be reduced to what genitals you have, and people who promoted gender binary, like there's only man and there's only woman. Here, people were not so quick to sympathize. People were actually pretty exclusionary.
Syn Strat found that in most news reports of trans discrimination, online Filipinos are much less tolerant and much more hostile, and they are much more simplistic, reducing gender to reproductive organs when personalities involved are not rich and famous.
Another big insight that we saw here is that religious codes still frame online Filipinos' views on LGBTQ plus political and civil rights. I'm sure this is something that we've all seen on an anecdotally on our own, probably experienced and saw for ourselves on social media as well. But it was also very interesting to see that it's still alive and well today in 2023.
Case in point, that story of a trans couple who got married in Albay.
And it got 13,800 plus engagements. They're a trans couple. They got married. That's why they could get married. When we looked at the discussions here, we saw that 54.4% of the comments were exclusionary. And when you look at the word pair map, the most influential clusters that we see here are God and Bible, which is pretty representative of the conversation. Discourses between those who were pro-marriage equality and anti-marriage equality were very neatly aligned with what their discourses of God and Bible were. If they believe that the God and Bible should be the sole basis of laws surrounding marriage, then they were anti-marriage equality.
The foundational importance of religion influences many other things, and more unfiltered Filipino sentiments come out in other issues affecting LGBTQ people, from economic participation to those affecting health, and then their standing in society. This had been evident in past Syn Strat studies. Ironically, however, their ability to gain updated insight on health matters as they pertain to LGBTQ communities are for some reason much more limited, because media coverage on some key matters seem to become more limited too.
Now, when it comes to health, as a dimension, maybe concerning thing that we saw that is that despite an increase in HIV cases in the Philippines, as in cases of HIV positive people in the Philippines, coverage in media remained pretty minimal. In fact, the only story that we could do a deep dive on that fell under this dimension was this particular AFP story on LGBTQ confronts monkeypox stigma.
Listen to former journalist Save Gregorio, who used to cover stories of gender. Save was one of the reactors at the webinar.
There is, I guess, not a lot of appetite to explore those kinds of stories, but that's an opportunity for media to really come in and do people stories. Na you discuss an issue from the lens of people experiencing these kinds of issues, because mas maging tangible. Hindi lang kami data point, hindi lang kami basta statistic, tao kami, di ba?
We're pausing for a quick break now. When we return, what do these findings say about how we see the LGBT community offline, or in other words, in the real world? Stories about things like schools and universities implementing inclusive policies, like allowing students to dress according to their soji, also received mixed reactions from online Filipinos. Acceptance, it seems, often hinges on traditional Filipino images of man and woman. A skirt for girls, pants for boys, Exclusionary comments advocated for stricter guidelines regarding the freedom of expression of trans students.
I guess ang take ko dito is that media should emphasize that LGBTQ plus issues are human rights issues. Yun nga, LGBTQ plus people are people too. So under human rights, also one of our fundamental human rights is enshrined in our constitution is the freedom of religion. Media should also discuss freedom from religion. Challenge that narrative, that dominant narrative, that freedom of religion means necessarily imposing your religion onto other people. Kasi what about other minorities, right?
Again, this is former journalist Save Gregorio, one of the reactors at Syn Strat's webinar. A recent SWS survey suggests there has actually been growing support for the LGBT sector and its advocacies. The SWS notes an increase in Filipino adults agreeing that gays and lesbians contribute a lot to the progress of society. That number was at 54% in 2013. 10 years later in 2023, it's at 73%. But another SWS survey from 2018 shows that while most Filipinos say they support the LGBTQ plus community, they also oppose proposals for key laws that the community is fighting for, such as bills that would pave the way for same-sex unions, for example. What we say online and in surveys, and then how we act on what we say, are two very different things.
The next dimension that we're looking at is political and civic participation. And an interesting insight that we saw there is that when pro-administration politicians support LGBTQ plus causes, exclusionary online Filipinos sanction them. In public policy, when we say sanction, that means people who had been supporters explicitly say that they are now going to punish you for supporting policies that they don't support by not voting for you anymore in the next elections, and also calling for other people to not vote for you as well.
Again, that's Mint Marquez of Syn Strat. Most Filipinos will say, therefore, it's okay to be gay in the Philippines. But many members of the LGBTQ community say that love is very often reserved for people like Bretman Rock, Boy Abunda, or Vice Ganda. And that's concerning for the sector, given that how trans people are treated off the internet is especially nowadays influenced and shaped by what they see online.
What's important to note for now is that a significant part of the narrative landscape centers on visibility indicators like drag pageantry and Vice Ganda almost single-handedly. We also took a look at how online Filipinos were reacting to these stories. And the response to the stories was overwhelmingly positive, we were surprised to see, with the majority of reactions actually being love.
Online Filipinos are more likely to support LGBTQ plus visibility in media and pop culture, but they are less so inclined in other areas of society. Here are the realities for LGBTQ plus visibility, advocacy, and success in public policy, for example. The SOGI bill has been delayed in Congress for more than 2 decades now. It was first introduced in the 14th Congress in 2000, but it has never been passed into law. The SOGI bill has been held back by opposition from religious groups and conservative lawmakers. These opponents argue that the bill would violate religious freedom and promote immorality. However, supporters of the bill argue that it's necessary to protect the rights of LGBTQ plus people. All the while, the anti-SOGI movement remains strong, backed by popular sentiments, informing politicians and elected legislators, and confident where true voter sentiments lie, senators and congressional representatives see no urgency or reason to stand anywhere else. Here, for example, are Senator Joel Villanueva and Congressman Benny Abante of Manila.
I don't know why who is following it up or saying that it is a priority measure, because it is not. To begin with, there are members of the Committee on Rules who had given us letters and reservations. So again, I don't see any urgency for that particular measure. Right now, I can tell you that there are about how many bills ito? Madami po ito na
We had a Universal Periodic Review of the United Nations, which proposed that the Philippines adopt laws which include protection against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression.
When you
Mr.
begin to
Chair.
mention about the human rights of the United Nations, I do not believe in the United Nations human rights.
Other studies have documented that LGBTQ people continue to experience discrimination and violence in all areas of their lives. That discrimination also means that they're more likely to earn less, have less opportunities for employment, and have less access to education and healthcare. One positive to note for the LGBT community, Syn Strat says, is that we do see a growing online community of LGBTQ Filipinos who are using social media to share their stories and advocate for their rights. The report recommends that the push for the SOGI Equality Bill should go hand in hand with initiatives that bridge the LGBT community with policymakers and the public.
For advocates and organizations, the main recommendations that we have there are to direct resources to projects that support trans people and that protect trans rights. In our research, even from last year's research, we are seeing that trans people in particular are vulnerable to hostility or vulnerable to violence. And so we think that it's really the trans community that needs the most support at this time.
Online and in social media, Filipinos might see all those likes, hearts, and care reactions and think things are getting better for LGBTQ Filipinos. But the reality is that on many matters, from violence against LGBT to the rights, these things are often overlooked, and society's views on transgender issues are far less inclusive. Here's writer and UP instructor Lakan Umali, one of the reactors at the Syn Strat Forum, with the final word.
It's kind of sad that sometimes it takes an LGBT people to be murdered for people to have some kind of sympathy for them, which shouldn't be the case. No, LGBTQ people shouldn't have to die for someone to respect or to sympathize with them. It should be something that we should be given. It should be something that we be given, that we be understood. Not just as these tragic figures that live in the margin society, but as productive, as whole, as complex people that live, in society.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Franco Luna. This episode was edited by Freddy Blanco. Our Teka Teka News executive producer is Jill Caro, and our senior editor is Veronica Uy. If you liked this episode, share it with a friend. Help Teka Teka News reach more people and keep the show going. Thanks for listening.